So we're going to look at two of Milton's poems today, pastoral poems, which I find really interesting myself, and it's sort of hard to categorize them other than to say that they are poems devoted to character. And character becomes a preoccupation of the 17th century, especially towards the end, when Lord Shaftesbury, or the third Lord Shaftesbury, writes a work called Characteristics, which I think is a great work. Characteristics of men, manners, opinions, etc. He writes this after Milton. He's born 1671, Shaftesbury dies in 1713. So characteristics of man, manners, and opinions. And in that brings into the consciousness of the British. I think it's already there because of the Puritans, the Puritan emphasis on character, on godliness, on holy living, etc., which you can see throughout the metaphysical poets. So particularly in the form of not just Donne, but Herbert and others. And the whole Puritan movement that gives rise to the Republican movement in England, the refusal to abide by the false religion of Charles I that leads them to eventually execute him and start up a republic. All of this is about the purifying of manners and politics and civic life, not just individuals, but character. So the 17th century really, although it is, we associate the execution of Charles to some degree with the topic of liberty. The reason liberty is important is because they want no restraint on godly character, and they think that under an iniquitous regime, godly character can't flourish. In fact, it's being suppressed and actively pushed in the wrong direction. And Milton, as we've seen regularly, places an emphasis on the freedom to act and his belief that people can act in accordance with their good character if they're not coerced by various authorities into doing the wrong thing. So the strong belief of what he's going to eventually call the paradise within. Happier far than being in a physical paradise is living in that manner in which the holiness that God implants in you by giving you the Holy Spirit is allowed to reign and govern you in your situations. So he's got a strong emphasis on character, very, very puritanical in that sense. And the Puritans are wrongly disparaged for focusing on trivial things like the 19th century Victorians were. Just manners and politeness and superficialities like dress and so forth, which are part of the whole thing, but the real thing is a pure heart. And so that emphasis on character that I think arises in the 17th century is the emphasis of these two poems. And the two poems look at two different types of character. As I say, eventually Lord Shaftesbury will write Characteristics of Man, Manners, Opinions, and really write the primary work of the moral sense tradition, which is significant in British writing. It's a really good work, I think, Shaftesbury's Characteristics. Not much read these days. It deserves to be resuscitated, I think. Because Shaftesbury observes, and I think this is interesting, that people change physically, biochemically, every 7 years, which people say to this day as well. You're not the same person you were 7 years ago. Every part of you has changed over the 7 years. So what does it mean to be you then? If physically the very thing that constitutes yourself, your appearance, everyone notices their appearance changes over time. But it's literally every bit of you has changed over the course of 7 to 14 years, whatever. Then how do we say that this person has an identity? It's not the physical you, because your appearance even has changed. It's not that you're totally different in appearance, but you are changing. As you're younger, you're growing into what will look like the adult self, but as you become that adult self, then you start deteriorating and degenerating in some ways because of entropy. You start getting gray hair or losing your hair or whatever, getting wider usually, right? So what is the you that is you? And it reflects on the topic that is of great interest to me, as you know from my classes. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? And Milton himself is interested in that in relation to Adam and Eve. It's not their physical characteristics. It's clearly not the incommunicable attributes of God. It's not his omniscience. It's not his omnipresence. Right? It's communicable attributes. Reason is one of his communicable attributes that we possess as creatures that bear the image of God. Animals do not have that capacity. We have a spiritual nature. He places his spirit in us. Does he do that with the animals? Doesn't seem so. And we have a moral nature, which is, again, a distinctive characteristic of human beings. We might be created on the sixth day just like the other animals, but we don't hold the other animals morally accountable for their actions because they never transgress moral boundaries. They don't know the difference between right and wrong. When they do something we don't like, we can call the animal bad, like bad dog, but actually the dog's not bad. He didn't have a sense of justice that he's contradicted. Only we do that. And so then, with those specific features of human nature being a part of the Imago Dei, then how do we account, even if we all have that in common, because that's the common ground, how about the differences between people? Because there are differences between people, and these days we try and solve or answer the questions of differencces between people, not just by appealing to free will, but by talking about personality types, or do a psycho study of some sort, the Myers-Briggs test or whatever their equivalents are, and there's a variety of them. And you notice that there's a sort of a general characteristics that reside in there. In general, in Renaissance thought, they will appeal to, interestingly, chemistry, and come up with the idea of human beings being made of 4 elements: earth, air, fire, water, and as a consequence having different compositions of things that we call the humors, the 4 humors. Have you heard of the humors? And so I've talked to you about this before. So they're trying to come up with a chemical explanation for the differences between human beings, while nonetheless calling them all human. So they're not so important as to change the category of what we're describing. They're all human beings, and yet there are differences amongst them that we can refer to as temperaments or different psychologies. Milton here, by identifying l'allegro and il penseroso, is not being exhaustive in his temperament, but probably thinking about the poetic character. Friedrich Nietzsche will do something similar to this when he talks about the Apollonian and the Dionysian, if you've ever read Nietzsche on this. William Blake will be doing something of this sort when, in his Songs of Innocence and Experience, he's talking about 2 contrary states of the human soul. Blake influenced by Milton on this, by the way. So they're addressing what, as I say, in the modern world, we tend to push into the field of psychology. The field of psychology, as we call it, does not exist in Milton's day, nor in the ancient world, the study of the psyche. And that's because they would not attribute character to the psyche. The psyche for them is going to be what all human beings share in common, namely they have a soul. But what type of soul? What's the character of that soul? That's the point of differentiation. And they will accept that you can have different types of souls or different types of characters, and one is not inferior to the others, of a lesser sort. It's just different. And nonetheless, some types of characters are better for certain things. So if you're a contemplative sort or il penseroso, then you are probably more suited to a certain type of life, the philosophical life, the theological vocation. You're a contemplative, the academic world. If you are a more like l'allegro, you're probably better suited to the public life, a cheerful disposition. Because again, we notice this about public, they have to have charisma. We call it charisma, or riz, I'm told. You gotta have charisma. Well, what is that thing? It's the thing that makes you attractive to other people. And it's not that you're anti-intellectual, it's the more that you're outward facing in the way you look at everything. You're external. That is suited to the public life. And ideally, the person will have the internal and the external married so that they can use their minds when they're directing their own actions and other people's actions. And the Renaissance man is the ideal there. You ought to marry those two, the contemplative and the active life. And those two types of lives, I don't know if I've said anything about this in this class, and I don't think I have, so maybe I should. But Milton is not wedding himself to it too strongly by his apposition of the l'allegro and il penseroso. It's not, strictly speaking, the active life versus the contemplative life. But I do think there's something in there. Shakespeare certainly does, having said that. And if you did the Shakespeare class with me, I talked about how Shakespeare often puts a contemplative sort in a political situation. And what we find is the contemplative sort decides to neglect public affairs, and the city goes to ruin as a result of that. That's the situation in The Tempest, for example, right? Where Prospero cedes the rule of his city to his brother, and his brother basically deposes him, even though he's the rightful heir or rightful ruler over the city. Because he neglects his duty, his brother comes in and pushes him out, sends him off to a desert island. And then we get all sorts of political theories being talked about in The Tempest. Likewise, we see a similar sort of figure in Measure for Measure. Vincenzo the Duke does not want to involve himself too much in politics and allows the city to go to seed, so he has to bring in a man who is more of an active individual, Angelo, renowned for his virtue, to take charge of the situation. He lets him run, and then you see the weaknesses of his position. And anyway, Shakespeare's playing with those ideas of the active and the contemplative life. Let me say a little bit about it, because I know that some of you have heard it, but others have not, and all of you need to. I don't have a marker with me. Okay, so you'll just have to listen to me, and I can't spell it out for you. But in Greek political thought, and here I'm citing Aristotle, there are two basic types of life that are worthy of human pursuit that he acknowledges. One is the bios politikos, B-I-O-S, from which we get biology. Is that? Just throw it at me. No? You don't trust yourself. Okay. I would catch it if it were catchable. If it hit me, I don't know. That would be rather amusing. The bios politikos. Politikos. That's the Greek for it. It's the political life. It's what the Romans will call the vita activa. This is from Aristotle's Politics, by the way. We'll talk about a life worthy of human pursuit, the vita activa, or in the Greek, the bios politikos, on the one hand. And this is the one that the Greek city-state was there to further. The Athenians were there to promote civic virtue by having civic involvement of the men of property in the affairs of the state. So they had the time to sit around, deliberate what the best course of action was. Athens was very much marked by this political life, and in fact, all the Greek city-states were, but Athens preeminent in this. But what was introduced by Socrates and written down by Plato, and what Aristotle wants to acknowledge as a competitor with this, of equal dignity, if not greater. Socrates says greater, but there's a debate over that, but it's certainly legitimate, is the bios theoretikos. Theoret. It's hard when it's in front of me. Theoretikos, yeah. Or the vita contemplativa. Now this would relate to, again, the sort of somebody who's cheerful, l'allegro, and more what we call an extrovert. There's the modern term. And these types of people would be more the introverts. Their attention was focused inward. And not so much that it's focused inward, but because they recognize what's inward corresponds with the ideals, with justice, with goodness, with beauty, with truth. Those are abstract in some sense, but they're things that you contemplate. You don't necessarily see the good or the just or the beautiful. You're meant to manifest it in some way, but you don't actually observe it as a physical object. Whereas this is going to see something and try and bring it about actively. You're trying to, and this is why the ideal is to have the philosopher king. Remember, Alexander the Great is the pupil of Aristotle. He is the man of action, but he was trained by Aristotle to think about what he was going to do. And again, that's the Renaissance ideal as well. So those two things, and one with an extrovert tendency and one with and in other words, action. And this more, again, of contemplation. These days it's more and more getting pushed in the direction of mindfulness, which I dislike, because the purpose of being attentive inwardly is not to be attentive of yourself, but rather of realities outside yourself and above yourself. It's a little bit too Buddhist for me, but I appreciate the attentiveness to a life within, the internal life. And this is, in general, is the academic life. Will come the church era. This is going to map onto two different ways of living, and this will be that of the kings and the aristocrats and the nobles, and this will be the life of the church. The clerics, the pastors. So it maps on, roughly speaking, that people will acknowledge these are legitimate vocations or callings as a general description. And Martin Luther, being the firstborn of his father, was destined to go into the active life. You're going to study the law then and go into politics. If you're the firstborn son of a nobleman or a wannabe nobleman, as Luther was, then you're destined to go into the active life. You're going to be a courtier. And if you are really, really good, maybe eventually you become the Chancellor of England or something like that and work for the king as his right-hand man. That's your ambition in life. That's the active life, and you will make money doing that. And as a result, your family fortune will increase. And so your whole family will benefit from that actively. So it's a part of the kingdom of God in this world is through that aristocratic vocation of serving the public by doing public good. And your next born, they can go into the church, because in the church they're going to serve a different master in a different kingdom, and there's no worldly wealth that's going to come from it, or there better not be. You don't go into church vocation if you want to become wealthy out of it, and if you do, then you're a very bad person in the church. You don't want people pursuing clerical orders who intend to get rich out of it. That's called simony, the sin of it. And Luther, who was the firstborn, found this the lightning bolt that went down, and he repented and went into the monastery. His dad was outraged because the whole family future was put at risk then. You can send your secondborn to this, or any of the other children for that matter, to the church, but your firstborn goes to serve the world, but also the family. This all gets broken up in the Reformation in some ways, because the Reformation will say that every vocation can serve God. And the idea of because even though from the worldly perspective, this is more important, these are the laity, and these are the clergy. And the laity actually have the money and the wealth and the power in physical terms. There's a tension between this. And even the priority of it, seeing your firstborn as you want them to go into worldly professions where they can make money for the family, is a sign that Christendom had not, to this point, sufficiently understood what Scripture says about the way in which everyone is a prophet, priest, and king. It's the kingdom of believers, and it's the priesthood of all believers. So everyone is a king and a priest in some way. And you can do that in every vocation, not just these two vocations historically that have arisen in there. So it creates all sorts of breaches in this bipartite division of the worthy occupations of human life. But in general, the reason this applies here is the life of il l'allegro is this one I'm suggesting. L'allegro will fit here, roughly speaking, and il penseroso here. And I say roughly because I think that Milton is already rejecting the delineation between the two. But I don't think, as modern commentators seem to suggest, that Milton is talking only about a poetic character or reducing it like Blake to sort of psychological responses, or from the vantage point of innocence and experience. I don't think that's what Milton is not thinking in those terms at all. That's what Blake makes of it. That is not what Milton's doing with it. And the Romantics and their legacy, namely us, we always see things through the lens of the Romantics as if the Romantics got it right, when I happen to think the Romanticism is one big mistake, more or less. More or less. And at least, even if we don't agree that I'm right about this, we don't want to assume that the Romantics are right. And the way that Blake interprets it to be is the way we ought to think about it. So I always try and present well, here's how the tradition develops, and then we can decide, based on the knowledge of the differences, whether one is more worthy than the other. But we shouldn't assume that the Romantics got it right because they were the latest, or that what comes from the Romantics, namely the psychological profiling, the INTJ, Myers-Briggs, is a scientific way of looking at human personality and character. I don't buy it. It's no more scientific than that of the ancient world. So on that note, I mentioned Shaftesbury, but I did not mention the writer that is most attentive to character in the ancient world. I've not mentioned him yet. And he, interestingly, so as I say, this is from Aristotle's Politics. I won't write that down because you've got it there. So this is just about, these are about vocation, not about human nature per se. Although interestingly, Aristotle says that the two characteristics of human nature is one, we live in the polis, and two, we have the logos, the political life and the life of logic. And these characterize human nature. There are things that are distinctive about human beings. We live in polises, and there are certain purposes of the polis, the city-state, and we use the logos. And by the logos, he means, yes, we use words, but also we use our reason. We employ our reason. Right? We are, or as the 18th century will repeat, Aristotle, that man is a political animal, man is a rational animal. That's how the Enlightenment presents it. Political animal and irrational. Note, there's more to the logos than reason. There's words. And that's obviously going to connect to Christian theology because Jesus Christ is the logos of God. And so it starts to tease out. But the writer that is most significant in the ancient world for his attention to character is actually the man who succeeded Aristotle and took over the Lyceum. The Lyceum is Aristotle's school. Founded by Aristotle. As we know, Plato founds the Academy. Aristotle was Plato's pupil, but when Plato gets sent abroad, banished, whatever, Aristotle founds the Lyceum, the school of the Peripatetics, so called because they used to walk around. Peripatetics. They used to walk around while speculating. And the figure that succeeded Aristotle as the head of the Lyceum was a man by the name of Theophrastus. Not much known. Has anyone even heard of Theophrastus? Probably not. Theophrastus, I think he ruled over the Lyceum for over 30 years. I don't know the exact numbers. You can find it out easily. And Aristotle was so enamored with him as a educator that he gave upon his death and his will, he gave the governance of his children to Theophrastus. He was a guardian for his kids. So he was his heir, the heir of Aristotle, and Theophrastus writes on character. But actually, most of his work is lost. Just like Aristotle's, but most of his written work is lost to posterity, but character remains. His chief interest, distinct from Aristotle, is probably in the area of botany. But he studies all sorts of things, metaphysics, physics, astronomy, like all over the place. But what we have in extant is a work on character, and much read in the 17th century, Theophrastus on character. And even before that, there's a character by the name of Paracelsus. Have you heard of this man? He called himself Paracelsus because he was better than Celsus, who's a Roman physician of the 1st century. And his actual name is quite long, Germanic name, but in the midst of that is Theophrastus Bombastus. How about that? I can't remember what his full name is. You could look it up. But Paracelsus, who was interested in medicine, and in particular, chemical approaches to doing medicine. So he was the first in the in the Renaissance era to use chemistry to try and address health issues. Just like today, we are employing chemistry to address psychological things or health things, and we use pills to do it. So Paracelsus did as well, and we know Paracelsus for other things as well. But and in general, he's associated with magic, Paracelsus, and with what do we call it? What's the discipline where they try and find the... Sorry? Alchemy. There you go. Yeah, from your Frankenstein, right? These are alchemists. So they're trying to find the elixir of life and so forth, which will be a potion. So it leans itself in the direction of magic. Anyway, I've gone all over the place and thrown a lot at you, but this is the character, Theophrastus, who takes interest in character, and character becomes of huge interest to the Puritans, because the Puritans are interested in godliness, and godliness is an attribute of character. It's related to righteousness. And without holiness, no one will see the Lord. Leviticus 19:2, cited by Peter. They want to become holier, and by becoming more holy and becoming more like God, the kingdom of God will reside within them, but also externally be expressed in their politics. So you can see that there is a consistent pressure on the importance of character. We saw it when we looked at Milton's work on chastity, right? The importance of the character of the young woman, a commoner in the midst of the temptations that ravage her. That was in the courtly work, The Mask. Okay, all that being said,